My brother lost my house, and my parents told me to just rent something like it was nothing. I can still remember exactly what I felt when I heard that. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, again. A heavy, dry pressure in my chest that made me freeze for a second, like my mind couldn't catch up to what was happening. And the worst part was how calm they sounded. Just minutes earlier, there had been a knock at my door. 2 men, a little after 8 at night, standing there with papers in their hands and a deadline of 24 hours for us to get out. My kitchen was still warm, the smell of lasagna coming out of the oven, my kids at the table with their notebooks open, doing homework. Everything looked normal. And then that bomb went off right in my face. I looked at the paper, then at them, trying to understand why my name was on it. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 39 years old. I've always been organized, the kind of woman who doesn't let things slip, who keeps her word, who handles problems before they turn into something bigger. I've been married to Caleb for 12 years, and we have 2 kids, Ethan and Sophie. I'm not impulsive. I never have been. But in that moment, I couldn't react right away. Because the problem wasn't just losing my house. It was knowing who had done it, and why. My younger brother, Kyle, the one my parents had always protected, even when there was no excuse left for the things he did. And I should have seen it coming. He'd been acting strange lately. Quiet, guarded, barely talking. I told myself maybe he was finally changing. Maybe he was finally growing up. When Caleb got home, still wearing that tired look from traffic on his face, he tried to understand everything fast. He spoke to the agents, asked questions, went through the paperwork. But it only took him a few seconds to realize this wasn't some simple mistake. There was a contract. There was intent. There was a signature. But none of it made sense. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't paperwork filled out wrong. I kept staring at those pages like, at any second, I was going to find something that would tear the whole thing apart. One line out of place, a wrong date, a number that didn't match. Anything that would let me breathe. But there was nothing. I called my parents right there in the kitchen, my hand shaking, the oven still on behind me, my kids looking at my face, trying to understand why everything had suddenly become so chaotic. They answered on the second ring. I explained everything. They went quiet on the phone, and then my mother said, in a tone that was way too practical for that moment, "Lauren, just rent something. Your brother needs us right now." I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, with the oven still on behind me, trying to understand how that had become such a simple decision to them. They didn't even ask if the kids were okay. If you've ever had one of those moments where you realize you can't count on the people who always said they'd be there for you, leave a like. Just so I know I'm not talking to myself here. Because what I found out after that, it wasn't just about Kyle. I didn't argue with my parents. Not because I agreed with them, but because the call had already told me everything I needed to know. They had chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. I lowered the phone and stayed there in the middle of the kitchen, still trying to understand how fast the night had collapsed. A few minutes earlier, I was checking the lasagna in the oven while Sophie worked on homework, and Ethan sat next to her pretending not to be irritated by math. Then 2 men showed up at my door with legal papers, and suddenly my house didn't feel like mine anymore. The oven beeped behind me, and I turned it off automatically. That detail stayed with me. Dinner was still there. The smell was still in the air. My kids were still sitting in the same chairs. But the room had changed. Everything felt unstable. Caleb was still near the door, reading through the paperwork again. He had that look on his face he gets when something is bad enough that he has to force himself not to react too quickly. He went over one page, then another, then back again. "Lauren," he said, quieter now. "This isn't just a notice." I walked over. "What does that mean?" He pointed to one section with his finger. "It means this already went through. This is enforcement." That word hit different. Not a warning, not a threat, not something that might happen, something already moving without me. One of the agents adjusted the folder in his hand and said they'd be back the next day and we needed to be ready to leave the property. I looked past him into the house when he said it. Sophie's notebook, Ethan's backpack, Caleb's keys on the counter, my purse on the chair. Ordinary things, sitting there like the night hadn't split open. "Mom, are we leaving?" Sophie asked. I turned to her and kept my voice steady. "We're figuring it out." Ethan didn't say anything. He just watched me, and that was somehow worse. Once the agent stepped outside, Caleb looked at me and said, "This was Kyle." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He exhaled slowly. "How?" That was the first real thought that cut through the shock, because Kyle shouldn't have been able to do any of this on his own. Not legally. Not by accident. I turned and walked straight to the hallway closet. I opened the safe where I kept our important documents and looked inside. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I saw the mortgage envelope. It was slightly out of place. Just enough. And that was the moment I stopped thinking this was chaos and started realizing it had been planned. I didn't say anything right away. I just kept looking at that envelope inside the safe, trying to understand how something so small could explain something so big. It wasn't missing, just slightly out of place, like someone had put it back without caring enough to get it right. "Lauren?" Caleb said behind me. "I think he was in here," I said. He came closer. "What do you mean?" I moved aside and pointed at the mortgage file. "I don't leave it like that." He looked at it, then at me. He knows how I am with documents. If I say something is off, it is. "You think he took it?" "Not took," I said. "Used." That was worse. Kyle had come into my house, opened my safe, handled papers with my name on them, and put everything back like nothing happened. Caleb went quiet for a second. "He'd still need your signature." I closed the safe and stood up. That part had already crossed my mind, because Kyle had been at my house more than once in the past few weeks. Quick visits, random excuses, staying just long enough not to look suspicious. At the time, I ignored it. Now, every one of those moments felt different. "He's been here too often," I said. Caleb looked at me. "You think he copied it?" I held his gaze. "Or forged it." The word came out clean. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then we call him." I shook my head. "Not yet. Lauren, I want to know what he actually did before I hear his version," I said. That stopped him. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once. "Okay." I walked back into the kitchen. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same anymore. And for the first time that night, the shock started turning into something else. Direction. Because this wasn't just a mess. This was something someone had done to me. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, but because my head wouldn't slow down long enough for me to even try. Every time I closed my eyes, the same sequence kept replaying. The knock on the door, the paper in my hand. My mother's voice telling me to just rent something, like it was a small inconvenience. At some point, I gave up on the idea of resting and just sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread in front of me. Caleb was upstairs with the kids, trying to keep things as normal as possible. I could hear soft movement above me, doors opening, closing, water running, routine being forced into a night that had already broken out of it. I went through every page again. Slower this time, line by line. That's when I saw it, my signature. At first glance, it looked right. Same structure, same flow. The kind of thing most people wouldn't question. But I did, because it wasn't mine. It was close. Close enough to pass, but not exact. The way the L curved was slightly tighter than mine. The spacing between my first and last name was off by just a fraction. Small things, easy to miss, not for me. I leaned back in the chair, holding the paper a little tighter than necessary. So that's how he did it. Not a mistake, not pressure. Forgery. I let that word settle properly this time. Kyle hadn't just crossed a line. He had planned this. I picked up my phone again and opened my messages. His name was still there, right where it always had been. No tension, no warning, just normal conversation from a few days earlier. Are you home? Can I stop by real quick? I stared at that message longer than I should have. That wasn't random. That was access. And I had given it to him without thinking twice. I locked the phone and set it down. For a second, I just sat there, hands resting on the table, looking at the papers in front of me. Then I pulled them into a neat stack. If he planned this, then I wasn't walking into it unprepared. By morning, I wasn't confused anymore. I was precise. I had barely slept, but my head was clearer than it had been the night before. Everything was laid out on the table again, but now I wasn't looking for answers. I was organizing what I already knew. Kyle had been in my house, he had accessed my documents, he had forged my signature. That wasn't a mistake. That was a sequence. Caleb came downstairs early, already dressed, moving quieter than usual. He looked at the table, then at me. "You've been up," he said. "Yes." He nodded once, taking that in. "What's the plan?" I slid one of the papers toward him. "We don't deal with him first," I said. "We deal with this." He read it again, slower this time. "The casino?" he asked. "Whoever approved this," I corrected, "because this shouldn't have gone through." He looked at me, more focused now. "You're thinking fraud." "I know it's fraud," I said. "They accepted a signature that isn't mine. That's not a gray area." That shifted something, because until then, everything felt like we were reacting. Now it felt like we had direction. "And your parents?" he asked. I held his gaze for a second. "They already chose," I said. That was enough. Upstairs, I could hear the kids starting to wake up. Normal sounds, steps, a door opening, life continuing like the night hadn't happened. I stood up and gathered the papers into a folder. "We get a lawyer," I said. Caleb nodded. "Today." I grabbed my bag, checking quickly if everything I needed was there. Phone, wallet, documents. For a second, my eyes landed on the keys sitting on the counter. My house. Still mine. For now. And that was enough. Because if they thought I was just going to pack up, walk out, and figure something out, they didn't know me at all. If you've ever had someone cross a line like that and expect you to just accept it, subscribe. Take a seat and stay with me. Because I wasn't leaving quietly. I didn't wait. By mid-morning, I was already sitting across from a lawyer in downtown Manchester, the folder in my hands, every page organized in the exact order it had happened. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and got straight to the point. No small talk, no unnecessary sympathy. "Walk me through it," he said, opening a notepad. I did, from the knock on the door, to the paperwork, to Kyle, to my parents. He didn't interrupt, just wrote. Occasionally nodded. When I finished, he reached for the documents. "May I?" I slid the folder across. He went through everything slowly, focused, the kind of attention that made you feel like he wasn't missing anything. When he got to the signature, he paused. His eyes stayed there a second longer. "This isn't yours," he said, calm. "No." He nodded once, like that confirmed the direction of everything. "And you never authorized any use of your property as collateral?" "No." Another note. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Then we're not dealing with a debt issue," he said. "We're dealing with fraud." Hearing it out loud didn't shock me. It just settled things. "What about the eviction?" I asked. He tapped the paper lightly. "If this was approved based on a forged signature, the enforcement can be challenged," he said. "Possibly reversed." Possibly. I noticed that word. "But?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "But we'll need to move fast, and we'll need to prove it." I held his gaze. "I can prove it." That came out without hesitation. because this wasn't guesswork anymore. This was structure. Good, he said. Then we start today. He closed the folder and slid it back toward me. And your brother? He added. I picked up the papers, aligning the edges without thinking. He'll be part of it, I said. The lawyer gave a small nod. And your parents? That one didn't take long. They already made their position clear. He didn't push further. All right, he said. Then let's proceed. I stood up, feeling something shift again. Not relief, not yet, but control. For the first time since that knock on my door, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was moving. The call came faster than I expected. I was back in the car with Caleb when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. Lauren Mitchell, I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Daniel Reeves from Gate City Casino, the voice said, formal, controlled. We need to discuss the outstanding balance linked to your property. I looked straight ahead, fingers tightening slightly around the phone. My property? I repeated. Yes, ma'am. The collateral tied to... That contract was signed with a forged signature, I cut in, calm. I've already retained legal counsel. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, just enough. I understand your concern, he said, tone shifting slightly, more careful now. However, the agreement was processed under verified documentation. Then your verification process failed, I said, because that signature isn't mine. Another pause. This one a little longer. Caleb glanced at me, not saying anything, just listening. We can review the case internally, he said. But at this stage, the enforcement remains valid. For now, I replied. Silence. I let it sit. I suggest you review it quickly, I added, same tone. Because this is moving into a fraud case. That changed the air. I didn't need to see his face to know it landed. We'll escalate this for internal investigation, he said, more formal again. You'll be contacted. Good, I said. And ended the call. Caleb let out a short breath beside me. That sounded different, he said. It is different, I answered. Because until that moment, everything had been happening to me. Now it was starting to move the other way. I looked down at my phone for a second, then locked the screen. Kyle hadn't just created a problem. He had pulled other people into it. And now, they were starting to realize it. The notice came that afternoon. Not a call this time. An email. Short, formal, careful. They were reviewing the documentation. They acknowledged a potential discrepancy, and until that review was complete, enforcement would be paused. Paused. I read that word twice. Not canceled, not reversed. Paused. Caleb leaned over my shoulder. That's something. It's not enough, I said, because I knew exactly what it meant. They weren't admitting fault. They were buying time. I forwarded the email to the lawyer. He replied a few minutes later. Good. Pressure is working. Don't respond to them directly anymore. I locked my phone and set it down. For the first time since this started, something had moved on the other side. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. But none of that changed the center of it. Kyle. I opened our message thread and looked at his name for a second. Then I called. He answered on the third ring. Hey, he said, like it was a normal day. You used my name, I said. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied, too fast. You went into my house, accessed my documents, and forged my signature. Another pause. It wasn't like that, he said. I held the phone tighter. Then how was it? He exhaled. I was going to fix it. It just got out of control. Out of control, like it had happened to him. You put my house on the line, I said, with my children inside it. He didn't answer that part. I just needed time, he said. You had time. Silence. No apology. No urgency. Just the same old pattern. I already hired a lawyer, I said. This is moving forward. That's not necessary, he replied quickly. It is now. Then he went quiet again. You're really doing this? He asked. Yes, I said. And that was it. No argument, no speech, just the truth, exactly where it belonged. By the next morning, Kyle wasn't the only problem anymore. My lawyer called just after 9 and asked me one question before anything else. Did your parents ever receive money from him? I stopped what I was doing and looked out at the backyard, still trying to understand why he'd gone there first. I don't know, I said. Why? There was a short pause, then papers moving on his end. Because we found transfers, he said. Several, not huge on their own, but enough to matter. They were labeled as help with expenses. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was shocked, because I wasn't. That was the part that made me sick. How far back? I asked. A few months, he said, consistent enough to raise questions. Questions. That word was polite for what it really meant. My parents hadn't just defended Kyle after the damage was done. There was a real chance they had been taking money from him while pretending not to know how bad things were. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, phone still pressed to my ear, and stared at the wood grain in front of me. That helps us, my lawyer continued. If they benefited from any part of this directly or indirectly, their position gets weaker. I let out a slow breath. Of course, that was what it came to. Not remorse, not truth, money. Send me everything, I said. I will. When the call ended, I stayed there for a second, holding the phone in my hand, feeling that strange shift again. Not grief this time, not even disbelief. It was clarity. The kind that hurts because it confirms exactly what you didn't want to be true. Caleb walked in and looked at my face before he even asked. What happened? I set the phone down. My parents were getting money from him. He didn't react right away. Just stood there, taking it in. Before this? He asked. Yes. That was enough. He looked away for a second, jaw tight, then back at me. So they knew. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. How calm she sounded. How quickly she told me to rent something. No confusion, no outrage, no questions about the kids. Maybe they didn't know every detail, but they knew enough. And somehow that was worse. Because now I could see the shape of it clearly. Kyle had done the damage, but my parents had helped create the space for him to believe he'd survive it. They always had. I picked up the folder again and aligned the papers carefully. That family version of me, the one that kept making room, kept explaining, kept softening things for them, was done. And this time, when it all came down on them, I wasn't going to step in and cushion the fall. By the time the hearing came, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. Everything was organized. Every document, every transfer, every inconsistency. My lawyer had built the timeline clean, without emotion, just facts lined up in the exact order they happened. Kyle was already there when we walked in. He didn't look at me at first. He was sitting slightly turned away, one leg shaking just enough to notice. When he finally glanced over, it was quick, not defiant, not even ashamed, just uncomfortable. My parents were a few seats behind him. That part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how small they looked. Not physically, just quieter. Like the confidence they had on the phone didn't exist in that room. I sat down next to my lawyer and placed the folder on the table, aligning it without thinking. The hearing moved fast. The judge spoke. My lawyer responded. Documents were presented, dates confirmed, signatures analyzed. At one point, the forged signature was projected clearly enough for everyone to see. Even from where I was sitting, I could see the difference. Small, but enough. Kyle shifted in his seat. My lawyer didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. This was executed under a false identity, he said steady, and approved without proper verification. Then came the transfers. That was the moment the room changed. The records were read out, one by one, dates, amounts, recipients, my parents' names. My mother lowered her eyes. My father leaned back, arms crossed tighter than before. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The pattern spoke for itself. Kyle finally tried to say something, voice lower now. I didn't think it would. Stop, the judge said, firm. You had multiple points to reconsider. That was it. No drama, no speech, just a line drawn exactly where it should have been. The decision came not long after. The enforcement was reversed. The property returned. Further charges for fraud were approved. I didn't react right away. I just sat there, hands resting on the table, letting it settle. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Final. Outside the building, the air felt different. Caleb stood next to me, not saying anything, just there. Kyle didn't come near. My parents didn't either. For the first time in my life, there was no attempt to fix it. No one calling my name. No one asking me to understand. Just distance. I looked at Caleb. Let's go home, I said. And we did. Not back to what it was. Back to what was mine. If you've ever had to rebuild something after someone crossed a line like that, I'd really like to know what you would have done in my place. Some things you don't forget, but you also don't carry them the same way anymore.